On November 12, 2022, a devastating accident occurred during the Wings over Dallas Air Show at the Dallas Executive Airport in Texas. A P-63 fighter aircraft collided with a B-17 bomber, killing all on board both planes. This tragedy, witnessed by a crowd of spectators, raised many questions about how such a disaster could happen, especially when the pilots involved had over 85,000 flight hours combined. Craig Huda, the pilot of the P-63, had 35,000 flight hours, and Len Root, the pilot of the B-17, had over 28,000 hours. Despite their vast experience, the collision occurred in a manner that left everyone in shock. How could something so catastrophic happen when these pilots were among the most seasoned in the industry? The story begins with a group of 5 bombers and 3 fighter aircraft airborne for the air show. The P-63, in the 3rd position of the fighter formation, was paired with the lead B-17, as both aircraft prepared to fly past the crowd. But just moments after lining up for their demonstration, tragedy struck. In what seemed like a split second, both aircraft collided mid-air, causing them to plummet to the ground, killing all the crew members instantly. As a retired F-15E fighter pilot and mission commander, I've had extensive experience in deconflicting aircraft in large-scale operations. Though I've never been an airshow performer, my background in complex military operations gives me a unique perspective on this tragedy. In this debrief, we will look at what went wrong and examine the lessons that need to be learned from this event. But before diving into the technical aspects, it's important to acknowledge the lives lost that day. Craig Huda, Len Root, and the crew members of the B-17, Terry Barker, Dan Reagan, Kurt Rowe, and Kevin Michaels, were all highly skilled individuals who did not deserve such a fate. Their collective experience amounted to more than 85,000 hours of flight time, making the accident even harder to understand. One of the critical factors that led to the disaster was the role of the air boss, the individual responsible for managing airshow operations. According to the FAA, the air boss is tasked with overseeing operations on taxiways, runways, and the airshow demonstration area. However, their role doesn't explicitly state that they must ensure safe separation between aircraft or guarantee the safety of participants. The FAA's definition is vague, simply stating that the air boss must conduct safety briefings and manage the event. This gap in the responsibilities of the air boss is crucial to understanding why the tragedy unfolded. It's important to note that an air boss is not an FAA certificated position. The International Council of Airshows, ICAS, oversees air boss qualifications, and they introduced a recognition program in 2019. ICAS describes the air boss's role as one of command, control, and mastery of airshow regulations. They are responsible for ensuring the safe conduct of the airshow. Yet this did not seem to be the case during the Dallas disaster. The air boss at the time of the incident had been in the role for 20 years. He held a valid letter of authorization and had worked at over 300 airshows during his career. However, he was not a full-time air boss. His primary job was working at an auto body collision center. His background in aviation included a private pilot's license and approximately 1,800 flight hours. Despite his experience, there were concerns raised about his ability to manage such a complex event. One airshow organization, familiar with the air boss's father, had reservations about the air boss's style. They believed that the father's approach was ineffective, and since the son had been trained in his father's methods, they were concerned that he would follow the same practices, which lacked clear and structured briefings. These concerns highlight a potential flaw in the airshow leadership, which raises the question, what was the plan to prevent the 2 aircraft from colliding? When multiple aircraft are flying in the same airspace, particularly when they are not in the same formation, there must be a clear plan to ensure safe separation. The lack of such a plan on the day of the disaster was a critical failure. The aircraft were not adequately deconflicted, leading to the tragic collision. Was the airboss aware of the positions of the aircraft? Did the pilots receive proper briefing on their flight paths? These questions are central to the investigation, and the answers may reveal systemic issues in airshow operations. To fully understand how this happened, it's essential to examine the technical aspects involved. First, how was the airspace structured during the event? Were there sufficient safeguards in place to ensure that the aircraft were properly separated? The lack of a clear plan and failure to coordinate effectively between the aircraft suggests that the systems in place were inadequate. This situation mirrors other airshow incidents, such as the 1989 collision at the National Airshow in Britain, where poor coordination and lack of safety measures led to another deadly crash. Ultimately, the Dallas Airshow disaster was the result of a series of failures in communication, planning, and oversight. While the pilots involved were highly experienced, even the most skilled professionals can be caught in a system that doesn't prioritize safety. This tragedy serves as a stark reminder of the need for better planning, clear communication, and a commitment to safety in all airshow operations. As we continue to investigate the details of this incident, the lessons learned will be critical in preventing similar accidents in the future. If no one understood the plan to ensure safe separation, then that would have been a huge contributing factor to the tragic accident. The key to safely managing multiple aircraft in the same airspace is deconfliction, ensuring that each aircraft has a defined space in the sky to prevent collisions. There are four main ways to deconflict aircraft: laterally, vertically, by timing, and visually. Laterally, aircraft can be given separate holding locations or show lines that ensure they don't cross paths. In the case of the Dallas Airshow, they had a 500-foot show line for the bombers and a 1,000-foot show line for the fighters. The idea could have been straightforward. Fighters would hold south of the runway and fly along the 1,000-foot line, while bombers would hold north and fly along the 500-foot line. This simple plan would have allowed each formation to use the full range of available altitudes without worrying about colliding with each other. Alternatively, aircraft can be deconflicted vertically. This method assigns each group of aircraft a specific altitude or altitude block. In this case, the bombers could have been assigned an altitude block between 500 and 600 feet, while the fighters would fly at 800 feet or higher. This would have kept the two groups of aircraft separate in the same holding pattern. Timing can also be used as a deconfliction tool. The airboss can tell the aircraft when to leave the holding pattern and in what order, ensuring they don't overlap in the sky. With proper timing, the aircraft can safely climb or descend to their designated altitudes, avoiding potential conflicts. Finally, there's visual deconfliction, where aircraft are placed in the same airspace with the expectation that pilots will visually monitor their surroundings to avoid collisions. The problem with relying solely on visual deconfliction is that it places additional burdens on pilots. As a wingman, instead of focusing on flying in formation and maintaining position, the pilot now has to keep track of multiple aircraft, adding complexity to an already demanding task. In interviews following the accident, it became clear that many assumed the plan was for the fighters to simply stay above the bombers. However, this assumption proved problematic. Without specific altitude assignments, the fighter pilots would have had to keep track of the bombers' positions or rely on the airboss to manage the separation. This is not only inefficient, but it also increases the risk of a collision, especially when pilots are tasked with monitoring multiple aircraft in the same airspace. The airboss was asked whether he assigned altitudes to aircraft for deconfliction. His response was that such circumstances didn't typically arise in airshows, which he did not consider to be commonplace. When asked why he didn't use altitude to separate the aircraft, he explained that different hard decks, the minimum allowed altitudes, applied to different locations in the airshow. He mentioned concerns about running out of available altitudes if everyone was assigned a block, particularly given the weather conditions that day. The problem with this reasoning is that when weather limits available altitudes, The solution is not to abandon altitude separation, but to adjust the number of aircraft in the show or restrict their maneuvering. In the Air Force, we frequently had assigned altitude blocks for each formation, but we also had backup plans to account for weather or other unforeseen circumstances. If necessary, aircraft would be removed from the operation, or their movements would be limited to ensure safety. The most frustrating part of the airboss's reasoning, however, was his claim that assigning altitudes could degrade safety. He argued that assigning altitudes, speeds, and headings could cause pilots to focus too much on their instruments rather than the outside environment. This is a misinterpretation of how flight operations work. Assigning altitudes does not diminish safety. Rather, it helps to ensure it. Experienced pilots, even those with 20,000 hours, can maintain an altitude while maneuvering, and using altitude separation would have prevented the collision. The issue becomes even more perplexing when considering the lack of a clear plan. If the airboss didn't use altitude separation and kept all the aircraft in the same holding pattern, what exactly was the plan for keeping them apart? The NTSB did not ask this specific question, which is critical to understanding how this disaster unfolded. Instead, the closest question was about the airboss's intent for the performance. His answer was vague, indicating that the fighters were expected to fly above the bombers and outrun them while the bombers flew along the 1,000-foot show line. This vague understanding of the plan and failure to establish clear deconfliction measures set the stage for disaster. With over 85,000 hours of experience between the pilots, the collision still happened because the systems and protocols for safe separation were not in place. In air shows, just as in any high-risk operation, it's essential to have a detailed and enforceable plan for how aircraft will operate together. Without that, even the most experienced pilots and airshow organizers are at risk of failure. Looking at the image from about 50 seconds before the collision, we see the moment when the fighters were ordered to move to the outside edge of the runway. To get there, they would have to cross the 1,000-foot show line that the bombers were using. When the airboss was asked how he intended to ensure separation as the fighters crossed the bomber's flight path, his response was chilling. "I can't. It's up to the pilots, the flight leads, and the individual pilots. I don't put constraints on them." Essentially, the plan was to give the pilots general instructions, but it was their responsibility to figure out the details. To make matters worse, he went on to say, "We do it all the time, and it's never a problem." This phrase, "we do it all the time and it's never a problem," is a textbook example of what's known as normalization of deviance. This is when a deviation from established standards happens repeatedly without consequence, and over time, it becomes accepted as normal. In this case, the airboss was relying on pilots to maintain separation without clear guidance, assuming that things would always go smoothly because they had in the past. But as we know, the risks of such complacency are often catastrophic, and the disaster that followed was the inevitable result. While the lack of clear deconfliction planning was bad enough, the situation worsens when we consider the briefing materials and communication leading up to the event. In my experience as a fighter pilot, a well-organized briefing is critical. A good briefing clarifies any confusion about the plan and ensures that everyone knows their role. However, the product given to pilots in this case was far from useful. The document handed out during the safety briefing was meant to provide a general overview of the airshow sequence, but it had nothing to do with deconflicting the aircraft. It didn't offer any information about how to maintain safe separation, and as a pilot, I would have found it largely useless. A good safety briefing sets the stage for a successful mission. But according to a witness, the briefing for the Dallas Air Show spent significant time discussing how the aircraft would converge at 1,000 feet and fly over the crowd in a deconflicted formation to end the show. However, there was little focus on what the bombers and fighters were doing before that point. No details were provided about deconfliction strategies, which is a major oversight. This is similar to what other airshow organizers had said about the airboss's father, that performers would leave the briefing with no clear understanding of the plan. This highlights the dangers of normalization of deviance. In this case, the pilots walked into the briefing with over 85,000 hours of combined flying experience. But no one questioned the lack of a clear plan. They assumed that everything would be fine, because they had done it this way before. No one asked, "What's the plan with the fighters and bombers after takeoff?" No one questioned the details of the deconfliction strategy. They were all relying on the airboss to orchestrate everything, but in reality, the airboss was relying on the pilots to manage their own separation. As the briefing ended, the pilots walked out unaware of the danger that lay ahead. There was no clear direction on how to handle the separation between the fighters and bombers, and the assumption was that it would all work out, just like it had in the past. One of the most critical aspects of this disaster that has yet to be fully explored is the presence of other aircraft in the airspace. Take a look at the yellow line in the image. This represents the flight path of a PT-17 Stearman aircraft, and the yellow circle marks its location about 50 seconds before the collision. Why is this important? Because the PT-17 was one of the ride flights that were taking place during this portion of the airshow. These ride flights are a popular feature at airshows, where the public can pay to take a short flight in a historic aircraft. When the Dallas Airshow was being planned, the chief aviation officer for the commemorative Air Force initially insisted that no ride flights take place while the active airspace was in use. He wanted them scheduled before or after the main show. However, he was pressured by higher-ups, including the airboss, and eventually relented, allowing ride flights to occur while aerial activities were ongoing, as long as they took off and landed when no other aircraft were in the air. This decision proved to be disastrous. 2 ride flights were taking place at the time of the collision. The first was a T-34 that landed just 6 or 7 minutes before the crash, while the bombers were still flying and the fighters had just taken off. The second was the PT-17, shown in yellow, which was landing at the exact moment of the collision. When the airboss was asked if it was normal to have aircraft landing during aerial activities, he admitted, "It's not commonplace." He also acknowledged that not all airbosses have the skill set to manage such a request. The fact that ride flights were taking place while the active airshow was ongoing added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. With multiple aircraft in the same airspace and no clear deconfliction plan in place, it's no wonder that the disaster occurred. In conclusion, the Dallas Airshow disaster was not a result of one mistake, but a series of failures, including the lack of clear planning, inadequate communication, and the normalization of deviance. The pilots were not given the information they needed to ensure their safety, and the airboss failed to provide proper oversight. In the end, this tragedy serves as a painful reminder of the importance of thorough planning, clear communication, and adherence to safety protocols, especially when dealing with multiple aircraft in the same airspace. The airboss's response to the question about how he intended to ensure separation between the aircraft was telling. "I can't. It's up to the pilots, the flight leads, and the individual pilots. I don't put constraints on them." Essentially, he was placing the burden of responsibility on the pilots to figure it out themselves. He further defended this approach by saying, "We do it all the time, and it's never a problem," which is an example of normalization of deviance. This mindset happens when people deviate from standard procedures, and because nothing bad happens right away, they begin to believe the deviation is acceptable. It's this kind of thinking that contributed to the eventual disaster. The reality was that the airboss was trying to manage multiple competing priorities at once. While overseeing the fighters and bombers, he was also attempting to coordinate a ride flight that was landing in the middle of the aerial display. This added complexity, distracting the airboss from his primary responsibility, ensuring the fighters and bombers stayed safely separated in the air. The ride flight itself wasn't the direct cause of the crash, but the distractions it created played a significant role in exacerbating the situation. Now, let's examine the flight paths of the aircraft involved. The bombers took off first, and the B-17, the lead bomber, made a right-hand turn as soon as it became airborne. It then curved around to fly perpendicular to the runway, before performing another right turn, to align with the 1,000-foot showline. This maneuver, known as a dog bone, is a standard procedure where an aircraft turns away from the airfield to gain the necessary space before lining up on the showline. The B-17 then entered a left-hand turn and flew a racetrack pattern, waiting for the fighter aircraft to join them. The fighters, represented by a green formation, also performed a similar maneuver, starting with a right-hand climbing turn and eventually joining the bombers in the racetrack pattern. By the time all 5 bombers and the 3 fighters had joined in the racetrack, they were ready to start the show. But there was no clear deconfliction plan in place to ensure that the fighters and bombers wouldn't collide. Let's now listen to the last part of the radio communication during this sequence. The air boss is trying to explain to the fighters where they should be and what they should do, but the communication is rushed and unclear. The first issue is the air boss telling the fighters, "You're going to follow the bombers, then I'm going to roll you back in front of them." But the communication is unclear, and the fighters don't fully understand what's being asked of them. The phrase, "that was not clear," is repeated by the pilots, highlighting the confusion in the cockpit. The air boss told the fighters to be on the 500-foot line, but this wasn't acknowledged, likely because the fighters didn't fully understand what he meant. Meanwhile, the air boss moves on quickly to give instructions to the B-17, leaving little time for the fighters to clarify their roles. This lack of clarity and the rushed nature of the radio call led to confusion. The air boss immediately switches his focus to the PT-17, a ride flight, without giving the fighters the opportunity to respond. This is a critical moment because the ride flight was competing for radio time, and the confusion from the fighters wasn't fully addressed. The pilots were left without clear guidance on how to safely execute the maneuver. As the situation progressed, the air boss made another call. "Nice job, fighters. You're coming through first. That will work out." However, the problem was that it would have been nearly impossible for the air boss, from the airfield, to determine if the fighters were actually in front of the bombers, as he assumed. The air boss repeated his plan out loud, but the fighters, especially those in the second and third positions, began to assume that they would be in front, and that there wouldn't be an issue with their positioning. This biased their thinking, setting the stage for the fatal misstep that was about to happen. At this point, the breakdown in communication and planning had reached a critical point. The lack of clarity about the flight paths, the rushed and unclear radio calls, and the miscommunication about the fighters' positions created an environment where pilots were unsure about their roles. They were left to navigate this confusion on their own, without the guidance they needed to ensure safety. In the final moments before the collision, the air boss's radio calls, instead of providing clarity, only served to heighten the confusion. With the fighters and bombers in the same airspace and no clear deconfliction strategy in place, the disaster became inevitable. The breakdown in communication, combined with the normalization of deviance and the failure to implement a solid deconfliction plan, led to a catastrophic loss. Just 15 seconds before impact, the air boss communicated, "B-17, you got the fighters in front of you off your left." The problem here was that, at this moment, only the lead P-51 was actually in front of the B-17. The other 2 fighters, numbers 2 and 3 in the formation, likely heard this and assumed that all of the fighters were ahead of the B-17. This miscommunication set a dangerous precedent. If the B-17 had actually seen all 3 fighters in front of them, they likely would have taken evasive action to avoid the P-63. But the lack of proper situational awareness or response indicates that they didn't. 10 seconds before the crash, the final radio call to the P-63 was, "Nice job, fighters. Come on through." This was the confirmation the P-63 pilot, Craig, needed to confirm his assumption that he was ahead of the B-17. The air boss's words, "Nice job, come on through," likely solidified Craig's belief that he was safely in front, contributing to why he didn't check for the B-17. Instead, Craig focused solely on following the P-51 ahead of him. Although, in theory, he could have seen the B-17, the two aircraft were on a collision course, and the B-17 likely appeared motionless in his canopy, never entering his peripheral vision. It's plausible that Craig, hearing the air boss mention the 500-foot line, or the outside edge of the runway, was simply widening his turn to follow the instructions, assuming everything was proceeding as planned. But, unfortunately, we will never know for sure. This is a key example of why, when micromanaging aircraft during an air show, you must give pilots time to process information, ask questions, and respond. If pilots are not allowed the opportunity to clarify their roles or confirm instructions, the system becomes overly reliant on assumptions. In this case, the lack of a deconfliction plan and the excessive micromanagement from the air boss created a false sense of control. The air boss was telling the pilots what to do, but had no real way to ensure they understood or were able to execute those instructions safely. Rather than offering clear, structured guidance, the air boss left too much to chance, hoping that pilots would simply avoid collisions on their own. The radio traffic was too congested with distractions from pyrotechnics, aircraft landing, and other ongoing activities, which further blurred communication and contributed to the confusion. When the air boss was later asked if he would change anything if given another chance, he admitted he wasn't sure how to respond. This hesitance is troubling, as it suggests a lack of introspection or recognition of the system's flaws. To make matters worse, when asked if adding restrictions would increase safety, the air boss said, "It's not fair to say that adding a restriction increases safety." This response is deeply concerning. Safety in high-risk environments like air shows relies heavily on clear plans and restrictions designed to prevent accidents. Flexibility is important, but it cannot come at the cost of basic safety protocols. The deadly truth of this disaster is that a series of failures, including normalization of deviance, poor communication, and lack of a clear deconfliction plan, combine to create the perfect storm. When you start removing safeguards, as happened here, the likelihood of something going wrong increases significantly. While much of this debrief focused on the air boss's mistakes, it's important to note that many deadly airshow accidents have occurred due to pilot error rather than failures in airshow management. One tragic example was the collision at Ramstein Air Base, where a demonstration team collided in front of the crowd, killing multiple people. If you want to learn more about airshow disasters and the lessons learned from them, including the 10 deadliest airshow accidents in history, I encourage you to click on this video. Thank you for joining me for this debrief, and I'll see you in the next one.